Puccini was the last romantic in the history of opera and became the creator of great emotions in the form of unforgettable female characters, such as Butterfly, Mimi, or Tosca. He drew his life energy and professional creativity to a great extent from the great feelings of passion which he sought in his real life in the many loves. Already in his lifetime, he was able to reap the fame, and it continues to this day. Who was Giacomo Puccini, and what places and people shaped his life? A biographical approach to the century artist from Italy. Puccini was born in 1858, the sixth of 9 children, into a family of musicians in Lucca, Tuscany. He spent his childhood and youth in the small town of Lucca. His father was the respected leader of the town band, and Giacomo's grandfather had even once studied with Giovanni Paisiello. His father died at an early age, and so Puccini was unable to make up his position as town musician. He received his first musical training from his uncle, who called him a slacker without talent. However, at the age of 12, his talent became evident, and he got the opportunity to play the organ in church and later play the piano in a cafe. So he already could contribute at an early age something to the family income. His birthplace is today a museum dedicated to Puccini. There in Piazza Cittadella he lived for over 20 years with his parents and sisters. One can find in the museum many objects belonging to the composer, among them the Steinway on which he composed, among others, Turandot. At the age of 22, he left Lucca for his studies at the Conservatory of Milan. Milan was the musical center of the north, and Puccini studied with Amilcare Ponchielli, the creator of the famous opera La Gioconda, among others, which was made possible thanks to a scholarship and the help of an uncle. He spent his Milan years in very modest circumstances, to which he dedicated his opera La Bohème. He shared a room for a long time with the later famous Pietro Mascagni, composer of Cavalleria Rusticana, and graduated at the age of 25. After finishing his studies, Puccini came back to Lucca and started an affair with his future wife, Elvira. Unfortunately, she was married to the grocer of the village. Elvira became pregnant by Puccini, and they left for Monza with their daughter, where their son Antonio was born. Marriage, however, became possible only 15 years later, when Elvira's husband was killed by a cuckolded husband. In order to give his career a boost, Puccini was eager to take part in the traditional one-act competition organized by the music publisher Zonzogno, who wanted to discover and promote young composers for his publishing house. He began composing in great haste and entered the one-act opera Le Vili, but his work did not receive any mention from the jury, let alone a performance. With the help of numerous supporters such as Arrigo Boito and Amilcare Ponchielli, money was raised for a performance at Milan's Teatro dal Verme. Thus, on the day of the premiere, musicians from the conservatory were in the orchestra, including Mascagni on double bass. The work was very well received, and the publisher Ricordi acquired the rights to it. This was the beginning of a long collaboration with the Ricordi publishing house, which had already accompanied Verdi throughout his life. Puccini was fascinated by Prévost's drama Manon Lescaut and its title heroine, and decided to set the work to music. The collaboration process with the librettists that followed was literally harder than giving birth to an elephant, for Puccini was never to make things easy for his librettists. The playwright Marco Praga, after initial hesitations, took on the role of outlining the work and Domenico Oliva provided the verses. Puccini began setting the libretto to music in 1890. He became dissatisfied with the original during the composition process. Among other things, he removed an entire scene, whereupon Praga resigned his collaboration. Ruggero Leoncavallo, who was originally to write the libretto, took on the task of revising it, but soon abandoned the project due to work overload. Now even Puccini and Ricordi also lent a hand themselves, until finally Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacosa made the final adjustments, especially in the Levé scene and the second act, and the roll call scene of the Le Havre act. This process took a full 3 years. In the end, Praga was no longer willing to give his name, and it was agreed at the premiere to publish the work without naming a librettist. During the composition process, the small Swiss village of Vacallo near Chiasso had the honor of hosting 2 greats of opera music in 1892. Puccini went several times between 1886 and 92 to the summer resort of this village and rented a house to work on his Manon. Diagonally opposite, within sight, Ruggero Leoncavallo was at work in the hotel that is now the Osteria del Teatro. Both hung posters out of the window as a sign of their presence. Leoncavallo, a clown as a sign of the Pagliacci, just premiered by Toscanini, and Puccini, a fist, as a sign of Manon, which means Manone, Italian, a fist. Leoncavallo even wrote a few verses for Manon Lescaut. February 1st, 1893 became a triumph for the composer at the Turin Teatro Regio. In this renowned teatro of the Piedmontese capital, the young Arturo Toscanini conducted the premiere and the longed-for success arrived. Puccini was unanimously accepted by the public and the critics in the first guard of contemporary composers. Interestingly, Puccini was already making the leap to his mature style with this work. The orchestra is rich in color, and he emancipated its role. From Wagner, who had died 10 years earlier, he had adopted the idea of leitmotifs. These are audible in the orchestra with entrance into dialogue with the singers on an equal footing. It is particularly noticeable that Puccini often lets the instruments play at the limits of their register and used this, as did his contemporary Mahler, as a stylistic device to portray the extreme emotional states of the protagonists. The Greuze melodies in particular are doubled by the instruments over several octaves. And with Donna non vidi mai, he succeeded in his first pezzo forte and mega hit. With Manon Lescaut and later La Bohème, Turin's Teatro Regio is the opera house with 2 world premieres of Puccini's operas. The opera house, dating back to the Baroque period, burned down in 1936. Short circuits had ignited the cables, which quickly set the wooden beams ablaze. It took until 1973 for a modern, beautiful theatre to be built. Puccini was an ardent admirer of Wagner's work, his favorite opera being Parsifal. 20 years later, he should make a pilgrimage to Bayreuth to assist a performance. In none of his operas was he closer to Wagner than in Manon Lescaut. Puccini made no secret of the echoes of Wagner and quoted even the Tristan short several times in Act 2. He also never again went as far in leitmotif techniques as he did in this work. None of his later themes were to be so Wagnerian as Nell'Occhio. The great love duet of the second act is an obvious counterpart to Tristan. They both share a triangular relationship. Man loves young woman who is already married to an older man, and the opera became a veritable Wagner festival. In La Bohème, Puccini may have been inspired by his fellow composer Ruggero Leoncavallo, who told him about Murger's Scène de la vie de Bohème. When Puccini casually told him a few months later that he was working on the setting of Bohème, Leoncavallo became violently incensed by the competition he was facing, since he was already working on it. Soon after, one could read in the newspapers about a rivalry between the two composers, behind which were also the two competing publishers Ricordi and Zonzogno. At the end, Puccini won 2-0 against his colleague. Firstly, because he wrote the more successful work, and secondly, because he brought it out a year earlier. But Bohème received a lukewarm reception at its premiere in Turin. The proletarian milieu was considered too ordinary and the music unusual. But after 6 months, the work was already able to establish itself. So Puccini managed with this follow-up to Manon Lescaut what other composers like Mascagni, Leoncavallo or Cilea never managed: to confirm the stroke of genius of his youth with a second successful opera. However, he did not copy his last work, since Puccini invented a new language for each work. If one compares Bohème with the works before, like Manon Lescaut and after Tosca, the temporal proximity is astonishing. While Puccini's music was never more Wagnerian than in Manon Lescaut, and never more veristic than in Tosca, it was never as late romantic as in La Bohème. Puccini gave each of his operas its own characteristic sound, just as Verdi did with his Tinta Musicale. Bohème has the conversational tone of a through-composed opera, supported by a large number of memory motifs woven into the scenes. Puccini was a close observer in this respect, giving even things like the bonnet or the muff their own motive. The second element of the specific tinta of La Bohème is the atmospheric music, which characteristically describes the scenes of the action and sometimes even has the rank of tone poems. The two beginnings of the second and third act, the street scene and the Barrière d'Enfer scene, may be cited as particularly successful examples. Puccini's orchestral language is masterful, and Verdi spoke approvingly of Puccini's orchestral power of speech. The German writer Tucholsky even gave Puccini, for his sense for details, the unjust judgment of being the Verdi of the little man. Puccini remained attached to his homeland throughout his life. He was able to buy back his parents' house with the money from his first successful opera, Manon Lescaut, and it still belongs to his descendants today, who set up a museum in it. With the income of Bohème, Puccini could even buy a property in Torre di Lago, at Lago di Massaciuccoli. There, at the shore of the lake, he could pursue his passions of the automobile and hunting. First, he bought a tower, renovated it, and expanded the property into a stately residence. He composed many of his operas there, like Tosca, Il Trittico, La Rondine, and Fanciulla del West, in this Art Nouveau villa. He maintained contact with local artists and fishermen who met regularly as a bohemian club. He enjoyed cars, speedboats, and pursued his hobby of hunting wild animals such as snipes. The house is now a museum and can be visited. It's inspiring. Music flows through the rooms and it is authentically furnished. It is a worthwhile destination to visit. You can even see the master's graph in the chapel. A Puccini festival is held annually on the lake in July and August. Several of Puccini's operas are performed on a large open-air stage. For his next work, Puccini chose Rome as the premiere venue. The premiere was then a huge event in Rome and was even attended by Queen Margaret. Yes, it's the one with the pizza. In the run-up, the mood was hostile. On the one hand, because the Romans were offended, since Puccini undertook an invasion of Milan with the artists of La Scala. And on the other hand, because the Papal Church acted against the anti-clerical undertone of the work. In the process, Puccini had taken great pains to make the original Roman settings and as authentic as possible in the style of Verismo. In addition, he tried to imitate the bell sounds of the nearby St. Peter's Basilica and commissioned a Roman writer to compose the lines of the shepherd boy in the original Roman dialect. But the Romans could not be appeased, however, and a bomb threatened to derail the performance at the last minute, but the piece was given. Among the notables was Siegfried Wagner, who praised the work, which was an accolade for Puccini, a Wagner devotee. However, the success of the premiere was moderate. Firstly, too unusual was the sheer brutality of the music. Critics even meant banality. There was even talk of a torture opera. In fact, Tosca is one of the most bloodthirsty operas in the repertoire. There are 2 suicides and 1 shooting. In addition, the leading female role commits a murder. Thus, at the end of the opera, no main character remains alive. As if that were not enough, Puccini also presents the audience with a torture scene on stage in the second act. After the lukewarm reception, the first performance took place shortly thereafter at La Scala in Milan under the baton of Arturo Toscanini, which became a great success and was to pave the work's glorious way. Illica and Giacosa were Puccini's most important librettists. They wrote libretti for Bohème, Tosca and Butterfly. While the younger Illica, on the left in the picture, was responsible for the plot and drama, the older Giuseppe Giacosa wrote the verses. Their relationship with Puccini was always strained. Puccini was never satisfied, and they often met in threes in endless conversations. The development of the libretto often dragged on for years. Endless discussions, years of back and forth, and lonely decisions by Puccini put a strain on their collaboration. After Bohème, Illica even shouted to Ricordi that he would never work with Puccini again, which fortunately did not come to pass. Puccini loved fast cars. In the year 1903, he had a car accident during the work on Madame Butterfly, the consequences of which disabled him for several months. Here a picture from his convalescence with Elvira and Tosca, Elvira's daughter from her first marriage. And again, Puccini reinvents himself with Butterfly. Puccini himself had never been to Japan, but nevertheless strove for authenticity. The Japanese ambassador in Rome helped him to obtain sheet music of popular Japanese melodies, and she personally played Japanese music for him on her koto, a stringed instrument, which Puccini notated by ear. Thus, Puccini repeatedly quoted themes and motifs in the exotic style in Butterfly. Analyses showed that he used about a dozen traditional Japanese melodies as motif or motive parts, and applied them leitmotively. Butterfly was the figure that was closest to his heart. The character of Butterfly undergoes a tremendous development in this opera, from geisha to outcast and lover, then to mother and lonely woman to suicide. None of the heroines of Puccini's operas can keep up with Butterfly. No wonder Butterfly is one of the most sought-after soprano roles in all of opera literature. Puccini called the third act the second part of the second act throughout his life. The reason was that the premiere in February 1904 at La Scala was a fiasco. Why is not 100% clear to this day. The main reasons cited again and again are the unusual harmonies of the music, the too great length of the second act, and probably a claque of envious people wanted to harm Puccini. The failure was shameful. Puccini, who expected a sure success, was in shock and never got over this failure. For Puccini, Madama Butterfly was the most soulful, expressive opera he had written. Puccini had many affairs throughout his life. Puccini needed them as an elixir of life. They created for him the great feelings that he also tried to express in opera. His wife Elvira resented his love affairs, and they were always a source of contention between them. A handful of women accompanied his path over a long period of time. Probably another dozens were casual love affairs. Puccini's booty territory was wide. He made love to famous singers like Maria Jerica or Emily Destin, with intellectual women like Sibyl Seligman, and even simple maids. In Torre di Lago, for example, he fell for a neighbor. Because Elvira was pathologically jealous, he hired students to play the piano for him at night to lull Elvira to safety, while Puccini rushed to the neighbor through the window. Other lovers followed. Elvira suspected her housekeeper Doria and pursued her with slander and hateful tirades. The desperate Doria did not know how to help herself, poisoned herself, and suffered an agonizing death. But Elvira was wrong. Puccini was indeed having an affair, but with Doria's sister. Only after Puccini's death did it come out that Puccini had another son by this woman who, strangely enough, was also named Antonio, like his firstborn. In 1909, the Doria Manfredi affair shook the Puccinis to the core. This scandal was widely reported in the press and deeply incriminated Puccini. It was reason enough for him to seek his artistic fortune outside Italy. From 1907, New York had moved into his field of vision. 3 Italians were active at the Met there. Giulio Gatti Casazza had moved to the Met as director of La Scala and brought Toscanini to New York. In addition, another Italian, Enrico Caruso, sang at the Met, whom he knew from Italy and with whom he spent a lot of time in rehearsals, but also privately. After the productions of Manon, Lescaut and Butterfly, The Fanciulla del West was the first ever premiere of an opera at the New York Metropolitan Opera in 1910. The production of the American opera was a publicity and social occasion of the first order for the Met, which was in the era of its golden years. For Puccini, the New York days were also the opportunity to have amorous adventures with his female singers, with Maria Jerica and Emily Destins. They are vouched for. The latter was the mini of the premiere. Perhaps the biggest star, Geraldine Farrar, was off limits to him because she was having an affair with Toscanini. The Fanciulla del West was received with tremendous ovations, even if the music could never reach the popularity of its predecessor operas. In 1918, the second premiere of a Puccini opera took place in New York. The premiere of Trittico at the Met, however, had to take place without Puccini, since a crossing so soon after the Great War seemed too risky because of the water mines. Puccini knew that Turandot was his last opera project. His health had deteriorated. In 1921, Puccini left Torre del Lago with a heavy heart because a huge industrial plant was under construction nearby. He moved to nearby Viareggio. The composition process of the opera Turandot was, however, not straightforward. It lasted over 3 years and Puccini fluctuated between depression and euphoria. More than once he wrote to his publisher Ricordi that he wanted to quit, especially how to solve the transformation of Turandot from a cold-hearted person to a loving woman burdened Puccini, and caused him to plunge into repeated compositional crises. Turandot is not the soulful woman who dies ready to sacrifice, like Manon, Butterfly or Tosca. How far away is she even from Mimi? Turandot is emotionally cold and deliberate. It cost Puccini a lot of energy to empathize with this role. It's quite possible that this was one of the main reasons that Puccini did not succeed in finishing the opera. Puccini's emotions belong to Liu, the little woman, the underdog of the plot. Puccini gave her the most beautiful themes, not Turandot. 3 of the 6 arias of these works sound from Liu's mouth. It is even possible that he used to overcome the tragedy of Doria Manfredi's suicide with Liu's heartbreaking sacrificial death in the opera Turandot. It's not a coincidence that Puccini died at the same place where Liu takes leave of the earth. Was it again the spirit of Doria Manfredi that haunted him from the afterlife? Already terminally ill, Puccini could no longer complete the opera. He went to Brussels on November 24, 1924, for a risky operation on his throat cancer, because Puccini was a heavy smoker. He still had to tackle the difficult final duet, and wrote on the sketches of this duet, Poi Tristano, and now Tristan. 5 days later, he died. By decision of his publisher Ricordi, Puccini's family and Arturo Toscanini, the composer Franco Alfano was commissioned to complete the work. The basis for this was formed by many existing sketches. However, there were some disputes between Alfano and Toscanini, since, in Toscanini's opinion, Alfano's music did not correspond to Puccini's will, especially since the ending became too bombastic. The premiere took place in Milan, 1.5 years after Puccini's death. Arturo Toscanini, the conductor of the premiere, broke off the premiere in the 3rd act after Liu's death music with the words, "Here ends the word of the master." The curtain closed, silence spread at first, until the audience broke into a never-ending ovation for the late master.